I am happy to welcome Professor Bonnie Lay. Bonnie is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Rochester. Her work focuses on how emotions and motivation shape well-being in relationships. She's published, I'm talking to her, she's published in many of the top journals in psychology, including Psychological Science, Personality and Social Life Bulletin, and tons of things in Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, not surprisingly. So we are very excited to hear what Dr. Lay will talk about today when seeing is believing, cultivating well-being and change through honest connection.
Thanks, Mike. It's so nice to be back this year and hear about what everyone's been finding in their honesty projects. And I'm excited to share some results from the project I've been working on over the last couple of years on honesty in close relationships. So we know that honesty in our close relationships has both costs and benefits. So on the one hand, when we're honest in our relationships, that helps build a sense of trust and intimacy. It helps us to come to know one another, and it also facilitates seeing our partners as good and moral people. But we also know, on the other hand, that at times when we're truthful and honest, we may convey hurtful information to our partners. There are these costs and benefits to honesty, and I was particularly interested in how three components of our relationships, intrapersonally and interpersonally, predict these relationship outcomes. And so I was particularly interested in whether the effects of honesty on relationships outcomes are conveyed solely by a speaker being honest. So is it simply important for one individual to be truthful and forthright in their relationships in order for relationship outcomes to be affected? Or could it be that simply perceiving your partner as a good and honest person impacts our relationships powerfully? And of particular interest, is it possible that we may need honest connections for honesty to affect our outcomes? And what I mean by honest connections is that they occur when listeners accurately perceive their partners to be more honest. And I find this idea interesting because we find in the interpersonal accuracy literature that when we are accurate about other people's thoughts and behaviors, that helps us coordinate our lives. We behave in appropriate ways, and we can plan according to the future. So there may need to be a congruence or some accuracy that occurs for honesty to have its strongest effects on relationships. So I examined these three components of honesty and their consequences for personal and relationship well-being, feelings of appreciation in the relationship, and also the motivation to change for a partner. Today I'll be presenting results both concurrently and over time. And I looked at these effects in two contexts, so one relatively negative and one relatively positive. The first of which was a relationship threatening context, but also a relationship building context. The relationship threatening context I was interested in is requesting partner change. This is something that's quite crucial in relationships, but it's challenging because couples raise highly sensitive issues. These issues can be taboo and conflict-inducing. They include things like requesting your partner exercise more, that they manage their money better, or they show more affection. Because these topics can be threatening in nature, it could be challenging for people to be honest. But we know that in relationships, we often need to change for the better in order to stay together and grow over time with the same individual. So unless we're truthful and honest about what we want our partners to change, it's very difficult for the partners to actually change that. I was also interested in honesty in the relationship building context of expressing appreciation. Appreciation is a particularly powerful emotion in our relationships because there's robust literature that shows that when we express appreciation or are recipients of appreciation, that reminds us of who's important in our lives, and it brings us closer to those individuals. And I think we're very much aware of the importance of appreciation, but at the same time, there could be reluctance to express it. So people often overestimate how awkward it is to express appreciation to others. And they also underestimate how positively others feel when we express appreciation. So these inaccurate expectations may make people reluctant to express their appreciation. But it's not just simple expressions of appreciation that are important. We may also need to be truthful about these expressions of appreciation. Some recent work in my lab has found that when we feign expressions of appreciation, so when we exaggerate how grateful we are for others, or we express appreciation when we don't actually feel it, that actually predicts lower well-being for the self and others. So this suggests it's not just any expression of appreciation that's important, that we must be truthful about what we are appreciative of for appreciation to have its benefits. So along with my research team, we're interested in the effects of honesty in these relationship threatening and relationship building contexts. And we expected some similar as well as divergent effects of honesty. So both in this threatening and building context, we expected that there's likely a direct impact on a partner's emotions and behaviors, both in the moment and over time. And specifically that in the relationship threatening situation, that if you're truthful and honest, that a partner's both more likely to change in the moment and over time. If you share that truthful information about what you hope for them to do, they may register that when they get the message and also in the longer term. And similarly, truthful expressions of appreciation may prompt a partner to feel appreciated in the moment as well as over time. But we thought there may be divergent effects for well-being over the longer term. We know in these threatening contexts that conveying information in a close relationship may build intimacy, but when that information is threatening, those positive effects of intimacy may be neutralized due to the harm or the hurtful information that may be conveyed. So perhaps in the moment when you receive truthful requests for appreciation, that may not feel so good for your well-being, or it may be neutralized because you're building intimacy, but also the information is hurtful. But over time, that may facilitate relationship progression and growth and overall well-being. However, when the messages are more positive in nature, these truthful messages are more positive, such as expressing appreciation, it's likely that both members will experience greater well-being in the moment and over time. So in our work, we pre-registered 3 sets of hypotheses examining whether a speaker simply needs to be truthful in requesting change and expressing appreciation for those outcomes to be predicted, or whether simply perceiving your partner to be truthful may predict these relationship outcomes. Or finally, it may be the honest connection that's required between accurately perceiving a partner's truthful messages to predict relationship outcomes. We tested this study in romantic couples who were all recruited from the greater Rochester area, and they completed a 4-phase study. They completed a background measure. They also engaged in a lab interaction, a 14-day daily experience survey, as well as a 3-month follow-up. And for the purposes of today, I'll focus on the background survey, the lab interaction, and 3-month follow-up. In the background survey, they completed a host of different individual difference measures as well as demographic measures, but I want to focus in on the key measures relevant to honesty. So of importance, in the background survey, all participants completed some free responses regarding 2 things they would like their partner to change, work on, and improve, and also 2 things that they appreciated about their partner. They also rated how uncomfortable they would be sharing these points of appreciation with their partner and also the change requests with their partner. And as informed by research online, we also gave them the definition of honesty and asked them to be as honest as possible when describing these requests and expressions. And specifically, we told them that honesty is about being truthful about your thoughts and feelings, not omitting any information and not lying. And this will be important for objective coding we do later in the study. After the background survey, participants came into the lab to engage in a video recorded interaction. And they had 2 discussions. So the first discussion was requesting a change from their partner. And the second discussion was expressing a point of appreciation. And the topics were dictated by what the participants said in the background survey. And we selected the free responses that participants said they'd be most uncomfortable discussing with their partners because we thought we'd have more variability with honesty that way. And so in each case, one partner was selected at random to share what they wanted to change or what they appreciated. And then they switched roles. So every person or every partner got a chance to express and receive an expression from their partner. I want to give an example of some of the change requests that were raised in the lab. So these were things such as changing your levels of anxiety or your negative mindset. This was pretty common, changing responses during conflict or how you express anger during conflict. Confidence in one's body image, and also putting more prioritization on the relationship. These are some examples of points of appreciation that were shared. People appreciated their partner's kindness and compassion, their partner's humor. They appreciated support during a grief event, or support of their own individuality. So after both expressing a point of appreciation or request for change, as well as listening to what their partner said, they completed a number of self-report measures that included speaker honesty, their perceptions of their partner's honesty, and as well as their well-being. When participants were receiving a request to change or an expression of appreciation, they also reported on how motivated they were to change for their partner, as well as how much they felt appreciated by their partner. And so the way we measured honesty was by adapting the truthful communication scale. This was before knowing about the state communication scale. But what we did was we adapted it to the romantic relationship context, so it was less of a trait measure for both the positive and negative context. And so we piloted this on 900 people in relationships, and this yielded 12 items. There were 6 items that tapped into honesty or truthful communication of thoughts and feelings. 3 items on dishonesty, which were reverse scored, and 3 items that tapped into omission of information, which was also reverse scored. So these were all averaged together, and items were measured on a 1 to 7 point scale. And when you were reporting on perceptions of your partner's honesty, these were simply changed to my partner told the truth, my partner told a white lie. After the lab survey, after 3 months, they also completed a final survey so we could look at change over time. And this is where they reported once again on their well-being, whether they actually changed for their partner or perceived their partner to change, and whether they felt appreciated by their partner. So the results I present today are from 206 couples, or over 400 individuals. And we still have that overtime data coming in over the next couple months. So we have about half of the sample in the follow-up survey. So I'll present those initial results today, but it's important to be mindful that that might change when we have the full sample in. Again, these were couples from the greater Rochester community, and they were on average 36 years old in relationships for 12 years. Most of our couples were heterosexual, but we also had some same-sex couples and also some individuals who identified with other gender identities. And the vast majority of our couples were in monogamous, married, and committed relationships with a handful of couples in open relationships. The majority of our sample was white, and about a little less than a quarter was of other racial identities. And the highest levels of education for most of our participants were either bachelor's or master's degrees. As an overview of the results, you'll remember I was interested in those 3 effects of the speaker expressed honesty, the listener perceived honesty, or the honest connection. So when we model all those effects together, what we're finding is actually the main effects of expressed and perceived honesty emerged as most predictive of relationship outcomes, rather than honest connections. So I'll focus on the effects, or the main effects results today. So first, some descriptives in the relationship threatening condition. We see that speakers express pretty high levels of honesty. And additionally, listeners also perceived fairly high levels of honesty, or quite high levels of honesty. And also, there was correspondence between speaker expressed honesty and listener perceived honesty, but this wasn't a perfect correlation. We could also visualize the matches between listener perceived honesty and speaker expressed honesty. So in 0, where the center is where matches would occur. And so we see variability in accuracy here. But the highest peak here we see is skewed towards the negative values, which indicates that listeners were slightly over-perceiving their partner's honesty on average in these change conversations. And so we also looked at the independent effects of speaker expressed honesty and listener perceived honesty on each individual's outcomes. And just as a note, these results are unstandardized multi-level B coefficients. So first, looking at the speaker's outcomes. When speakers reported expressing more honesty about what they wanted their partners to change, independent of whether their partners perceive them as honest, that predicted their own personal and relationship well-being. But we also saw that when listeners simply perceived the speakers as honest, independent of whether those speakers were actually honest, that also predicted the speaker's personal and relationship well-being. So turning to the listener's outcomes, or the individuals receiving requests to change, when speakers were honest, that predicted greater relationship quality for the listener, as well as greater motivation to change for the partner. And the more that listeners perceived honest expressions from their partner about change, the more they also reported greater personal and relationship well-being and greater motivation to change. So these results are quite interesting and fairly robust, indicating that even in these negative contexts, we're actually seeing positive effects of honesty. So what do we see happening over time? When it comes to the speaker's outcomes over time, we're seeing how honest they were in the lab didn't predict their feelings 3 months later. It was really being perceived by their partners as being honest that predicted greater personal well-being and relationship quality for the person who had requested change. And also, the more that listeners perceived speakers to be honest, the speakers are more likely to perceive their partners to actually have changed. So here we're seeing being perceived as honest as having predictive effects on your own outcomes. When it comes to the listener outcomes or the person receiving a request to change, we find some interesting results here. So the more honest speakers were in the lab, the less likely that listeners reported changing 3 months later. So that was an unexpected finding. And the more that listeners perceived speakers to be honest, the more likely they were to change. So the perceptions of honesty rather than actual honesty was predicting partner-reported change over time. So thinking about these results more collectively, when we see the current results immediately after the lab, we see that a speaker's honesty is predicting their own personal well-being, and a listener's perception of speaker's honesty is also predicting their own well-being. But when it comes to these more relational outcomes, including relationship quality and whether you're going to change for your partner, it was both the expression of honesty and the perception of honesty that mattered. Over time, we're seeing that being perceived as an honest, well, this isn't true. So being perceived as honest in the lab when you share their change request predicts a speaker's greater well-being. So being perceived as honest is predicting long-term outcomes for the person expressing these difficult change requests. But when it comes to listener change, we're seeing some divergent effects. So greater honesty from the speaker is actually predicting less change for the listener. But if they perceive their partner to be honest, they're actually more likely to change. So what are we finding in the more positive context of a relationship building appreciation? In terms of descriptives, we're seeing some similar findings. So we're seeing pretty high levels of expressed honesty from the speaker, as well as high levels of perceived honesty from the listener. And interestingly, these means don't look different between a more negative context and a positive context. We're also seeing some correspondence between expressed honesty and perceived honesty, but again, that's not a perfect correspondence. When we look at matches between what speakers reported as their honesty and what listeners perceived in honesty, we're seeing some variability. But again, we're seeing a peak right in this negative value range here, again indicating that there's a trend towards over-perceiving your partner's honesty when they express something positive, a point of appreciation. And here we're seeing a higher frequency in the negative context. And turning to the prediction of outcomes concurrently or right after the lab session, when speakers were honest about their points of appreciation, that predicted their own personal and relationship well-being positively. And the same was true when listeners perceived speakers to be honest about their expressions of appreciation. When it came to the listeners' outcomes, the speakers' expressed honesty was less predictive than their mere perception of the speaker's honesty. So when speakers were honest about appreciation, that predicted greater personal well-being for the listener. But it was really the perceptions of a speaker's honesty that mattered more in predicting outcomes for the listener. So when listeners perceive their partners to be honest, independent of their partner's honesty about appreciation, they felt more personal well-being, relationship quality, and they were more likely to feel appreciated. In terms of the over-time results, we're seeing a similar pattern as in the change conversation, that the speaker's honesty had less of a bearing on their own outcomes than did the listener's perception. So when listeners perceived their partners to be honest about appreciation after the lab, 3 months later, those speakers reported greater well-being. But interestingly, there weren't longer-term effects on the listener's outcomes for both speaker-expressed honesty and listener-perceived honesty. So thinking about these results collectively, concurrently, we see, again, that a speaker's honesty predicts their own personal and relationship well-being. But the perception of the partner's perceptions of honesty were more predictive of both partners' well-being. And we see over time that when partners merely perceive their partners to be honest about appreciation, that predicted speakers' well-being. So I want to highlight a couple of current directions that we're taking with this work. So I highlighted some results of the self-report measures that we are finding in the moment and over time. But what we're currently working on now is objective reports of honesty. So as I mentioned in the background survey, participants reported on the change and appreciation towards their partner, and we asked them to be as honest as possible. And what we have a team of coders doing currently is comparing what participants wrote in the background survey to what they actually said in the lab and rating their honesty. And we're actually finding variability there. So currently we're working on the change conversation, and it's interesting that the deviations of honesty tend to be more omissions of information, so they might write something more severe than they actually say, or kind of minimizing how serious things are. So it's not that big of a deal, despite reporting it being very important in the background survey. So I think it'll be interesting, really interesting to see if there's correspondence between the objective measures of honesty as well as the self-report measures. We're also coding for qualities of the speaker's expressions. That includes benevolence, bluntness, restraint, and disclosure. Because it's possible that the effects of honesty are moderated by the way that couples communicate their messages. So we found that interesting effect that the more honest speakers were, the less likely targets were to change over time, or listeners were to change over time. Perhaps that might have to do with the way they're communicating the message. Would that be different if they're high in benevolence? Or perhaps would there be stronger effects of honesty for appreciation if people were less restrained about those positive messages? And we're also wrapping up a 14-day daily experience survey. So Mike really nicely talked about all of the great things we can learn from daily experience surveys. What I presented today was one highly impactful conversation in the lab. So we're looking at the independent effects of expressed and perceived honesty for one event, as well as trying to understand the effects of an honest connection for one event. But in a 14-day daily experience study, we could have multiple observations, importantly outside the lab, that are more naturalistic. So that gives more instances in which partners may accurately or inaccurately perceive their partner's honesty, and perhaps those more naturalistic experiences may yield more matches. So again, this is over 4,000 observations that we're looking at in both relationship threatening and relationship building contexts. And so I think there are interesting implications of this work. We certainly find dyadic effects of honesty. And interestingly, both in the relationship threatening and relationship building context, we're seeing that expressions and perceptions of honesty are predicting benefits for both individuals, even in those negative contexts. And we're seeing more widespread effects for simply being perceived as honest by your partner. So when your partner perceives you as honest, that predicts well-being for you as well as your partner. We're also seeing more longer-term effects in the relationship threatening context. And it could be that there's more to gain. There's also possibly more to lose, but we're seeing actually benefits here. But maybe there's more to benefit from when partners are sharing honest and truthful information about ways to bring their relationship further and better. And interestingly, partners didn't need to be accurate or connect on the honest expressions and perceptions for the effects of honesty to emerge. We're seeing more of a more is better effect. So more honesty and more perceived honesty tended to predict more benefits. So it'll be interesting to see in the future how individual difference measures or qualities of communication may moderate those effects. And finally, it'll be interesting to see once we have the full overtime data if honest connections emerge there or these results are consistent with what I showed today. And also whether there are honest connections in daily life when we're looking at naturalistic instances across multiple observations. But finally, it could just be that accuracy or connection about honesty is challenging. We know it's difficult to accurately detect detection or deception and lying, and that could be true for honesty in couples as well. So this has been something that's been top of mind that I've been thinking about and I'd love your thoughts about. But perhaps there are other contexts or even other interpersonal relationships in which accuracy may be more consequential. So with that said, I just want to acknowledge my research team, my project manager, Anna, and wonderful grad students, Claire Shimshock, Princeton Shi, and Jenny Lay, and the wonderful team of research assistants who've done all those lab sessions and the coding and the diaries. And thank you to the Honesty Project team and Templeton Foundation for your support.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. So if you all want to raise hands for any questions.
Me?
I think you were first. You go.
Thanks, Bonnie. I wonder if you have any sense of why the perceived honesty is generating so much additional well-being, because I mean, it could be that there are many factors behind that. Like, it might be that the partner that's doing the hearing appreciates the other person trying, or it might be that they're learning things they otherwise wouldn't have, or it might be that they see them realizing things about themselves they're now willing to share, but they themselves didn't know that yet. And so it's like there could be lots of things that are the reasons for why they appreciate it.
So you're particularly interested in why the perceptions of appreciation predict.
The channel, that perception from the hearer, listener perceived honesty, but like that seems like it encapsulates a number of different things that are causing appreciation. I'm wondering if you have any.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually talking about some of this at dinner last night. This is something I'm still wrapping my head around and figuring out. So thinking about perceptions of honesty positive or predicting positive outcomes, I think the first important thing we're going to have to do is to rule out just general positive perceptions of your partner predicting positive outcomes. I think that's something important to look at. But yeah, it's interesting. Accuracy didn't matter. And so I wonder if there's something else that's going on that couples are conveying to one another when there's this perceived honesty, and particularly when there's expressed honesty. So when you're expressing honesty, perhaps your partner doesn't pick up on that, but is the content you're sharing particularly different or particularly helpful, even though you don't realize that they're being honest or not? So in that direction, I'm starting to chip away at it, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around that perception effect. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that.
It could be that in some settings, the mere I mean, it depends on the relationship of the partners, but like sometimes just being able to go to the lab and have a quiet, undistracted conversation is like really valuable.
Yeah.
Apart from whether there's honesty or perceived honesty, like what I'm wondering is whether the appreciative stuff is turning on something more specific in lots of cases, like, oh, you're really trying to do more sharing than you used to do or something.
Yeah.
But whether it's an honest sharing is not really the point. The point is like these other effects.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would wonder if it was something about, that lab experience that's affecting the appreciation experience in particular. But we're actually seeing more robust effects in the change context. So the fact that there's a little bit of divergence there suggests that it might, I don't know if there's something just globally positive about that lab experience. So I'm not sure if it's that in particular.
Yeah, so thanks. Such interesting work. I wanted to hear your thoughts about kind of the context you set up and the kind of prescriptions you make. So the one thing that I'm thinking through is when you've mutually consented to be in a situation in which we might do this and we might share even negative information, it's really positive to then be honest within that, right? Because we've already consented both to kind of put ourselves into this situation, and also the fact that you're being honest with me enables me to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. But a lot of, I think, the dilemmas arise when the alternative is like, I could pretend like I don't believe there's anything you should change, and we don't have this conversation at all. Right. And so, there's kind of potential positive effects of being honest, conditional on us engaging in this act together, right. Which I think what you're really beautifully capturing. But I wonder, when the alternative is like, we could just not do this, right. How should we think about that?
Yeah, I think there certainly could be a demand characteristic there, which is what you're getting at, which is...
I don't think it's demand. Yeah, I don't think it's demand. It's not criticism. Like, I think, I almost see, and I've done studies like this too, it's almost, as you said, like a form of therapy, right? Like, when people go to therapy, it's really good to be honest. Right. But the question is like, there's a question about another literature, is like, is going to therapy actually positive or negative or positive, because it brings up all this negative stuff. So anyway, I don't see it as a demand. It's more of a conceptual question.
So I guess you're seeing it more of, is there just something about that positive experience of just sitting down to discuss?
Just like, do you interpret the effects as the prescription being have these conversations and they should expect benefits?
I follow your point now. That's been something that I've been thinking about now that we're seeing the results. Because before we had the results, we really kind of, I'm in a group of 3 relationships labs, discuss how can we drive down these honesty reports when we bring people to the lab, because we're up against some other dilemmas. So Bill Chopik really nicely highlighted in his work, by the time we get couples in the lab, we're getting pretty satisfied couples. So one thing we discuss is how do we get those couples who are maybe less satisfied? And really in talking to clinical psychologists, we have to actively recruit distressed clinical samples. That would be just very, very hard to get in the lab. There are some things we could do to try to account for that. So I should have mentioned that we also assess baseline relationship quality when people came to the lab. And when we control for those results, we don't see them change. So it wasn't simply that happier couples were being more honest, which is why they were happier. So we get at some of those things. But I do think that there is something, now that I see the results of the positive effects in the negative context, I think there was maybe something just simply beneficial to sitting down and having a truthful discussion about this change. And so that could be something about the lab, or maybe something fundamentally different about romantic partners as well. Because here, this negative information is something that, if they actually just sat down and had a structured conversation about it, this does convey information that's beneficial to both people in the relationship moving forward. So it could be something about when that negative information is really helpful for both individuals in the longer term, maybe that negative impact isn't so strong. But yeah, great question.
Just a small question about accuracy. And I totally hear you. The punchline of this is that it doesn't matter, but just out of curiosity and in case it matters in other contexts, did you happen to look at it seemed like your items were honesty and dishonesty. I'm just curious, are they overestimating honesty or underestimating the dishonesty?
Yeah, I haven't teased those apart yet, but that's something that I want to look at next. Because I think in these conversations, or at least in the videos that I've been watching, you'll see that when people are being dishonest in the honesty in the honesty behavioral codes we're doing, usually they'd be truthful about components, but then they would tell a white lie about something not being so severe or omitting information. So I don't know which component yet is driving those effects. I mean, they're also highly correlated, they hang together, but I think that's certainly something to dig into in the future.
I was wondering, I was surprised to see as much the good outcomes of listener perceived quality controlling for speakers' quality, because wondering about the need, what it represents, and isn't this mostly that your partner is very good at lying? Because if you control for speakers' rated quality, and what's left is
If you control the speakers, what's left is they're lying. Well, I see it more as, I guess, it being independent of whether they're being honest or not, rather than whether they're lying, right? Or I mean,
multiple regression coefficients, we should do the both, or is
yeah, or multi-level coefficients.
Oh, then I think okay.
Oh,
It could
sorry.
be, it could be no, because if they were independently correlated, even with the regression, that would not hold. But then, yes, I think it could also be, at least in part, how good your partner is applying to
Yeah.
it.
That would be interesting. It would be interesting to test that actually directly, how good the partner is at lying, if that would be predictive. I'm trying to think of a way how we could potentially rule that out in our data now. I mean, based on what you're using. But yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear the psychology side of this and working on trust, so it was cool to see the application side of it. I was wondering if in the initial survey and initial questions that you asked them before they had the conversation, if there was sort of agreement among the couples about like why they were interested in participating in the study, if it was just like something to do on a Saturday and to make a little extra money. Like, I was just wondering sort of what incentivized people to participate in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we didn't probe participants on that in particular. They were compensated, so of course there was pay for that. But in terms of their motivations, we didn't probe that in particular.
Okay, cool.
Great talk. I was super excited to see the results from last year. And I have two questions. One is, in your coding, are you seeing any behaviors from the listener that are clear indicators of what they're using to assess honesty in their partners? Is it content-based, or are their partners doing specific behaviors that are then predictive of their perceptions of honesty? And are you doing any coding to see, like, are people who are perceiving more honesty becoming more responsive in these conversations, to see like what are they doing that's now driving these positive effects later because they're perceiving honesty from their partner?
Okay, so the question is about what we're seeing in the codes for a listener's perception of honesty. So we're actually not coding for their perception, since that's so subjective. We're coding for the expressed or the objective expressed honesty of the speaker.
Right, but can you look at what of those are going to predict me perceiving honesty?
Right,
Like,
yeah.
is it that when my partner leans in, really, I think that they're being honest, or is it all content based that I know my partner, and so the things that they say are the best indicators of whether I think they're being honest?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, we could definitely get hints at that. So we're looking at emotional expressions. We're also going to content code kind of the types of topics that they're bringing up. So maybe some topics would affect that more. But yeah, looking at their emotional expressions, we're not coding particular behaviors, although I'd be interested if you think there might be certain behaviors that would be predictive of that.
I actually have a follow-up now based on your question. I'm curious if you think the perceptions of honesty that are being reported by the participants is more indicative of what occurred in that given situation, or maybe their general assessment of their partner. Because unless like I'm imagining me going, with my husband to a study, and us having a conversation like this, and unless he explicitly said things that were like, oh, that's, not how you've said that before, I think I just assume his level of honesty was what I already perceive it to be. So I'm wondering if you would be able to find behavioral connections or not. I don't know. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't probed that yet. We also looked at the general trait perceptions of a partner's honesty. So we could compare what we're seeing in these specific contexts of their trait level. So I'll have to get back to you on that, but we could actually look at whether there was variation from these specific contexts to globally, do I see you as truthful?
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Thanks.
Another separate question, sorry. Thinking about the different types of conversations that they had and the examples that you gave, I wonder if you have any questions that are assessing these things, or if you could code them to see the change requests seem to be like long-standing things that partners do, like you're a very negative person, or like you see your body image very poorly. Those are probably like years I'm doing that. Whereas the appreciation one seemed a little bit more momentary. Like you were very supportive of me when I went through this grief. And so I wonder if you have any insights there about whether that's actually true, or those are just the examples that you put on the slide, and whether that might be driving the more robustness or the change conversations versus the appreciation conversations.
Okay, so the more robustness may be due to just a general stability or severity of, of these topics. Yeah, we do have some data. We just got this data in, so this gives me good ideas to check out. But we could actually look at the severity of these change requests. And so perhaps it could be that these more severe issues are bringing the more stable effects forward, and less severe not. So that's something we could definitely probe and test.
Other questions? Okay, well, thank you. And